between now and your exam. I don't know if these questions are going to come up. I'm not, I can't say for sure that these questions are going to come up. But all I will say is that in this next week, if you were to focus on these essays, I would imagine that these essays may come up in the final exam. In the same way, we predicted, or at least we found that out of all the questions we looked at for paper one, there was a pathway through the exam, wasn't there? Okay, and that pathway was pretty clear. So that's my plan anyway. My plan is to go through as many questions that I think you should focus on today. I'm not going to be able to plan them in any great detail with you. If you do want to have detailed plans for these questions, I've got a very cheap, it's a £8 or whatever it is on my website, and you can just download all of the plans for UK government, and that's all on my website, and you can access them in your own time. Okay, right. So good. Okay, so again, just looking at yeah, is my volume not loud enough? Is that what we're saying? Because maybe I need to turn the sound up if it's not loud enough. No, it's on the top volume, so I think it may be a problem at your end. No, I'm not in Turkey now. I'm back home. I'm back in the UK. So yeah, that's good. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so you guys like my plans, and you think the plans, yeah, I think the plans are well worth it. If you think that, so here's what I'm going to say. So let me start. I'm getting distracted by your too many messages, guys. You're distracting me. So let's focus. If you feel that all you need really are plans, then my suggestion to you is access my plans from my website. If you think that you actually need explanation on my plans, so you need someone to go through in essay by essay what you should know about these plans in some more detail, with a lot more examples and a lot more contemporary knowledge, then I would suggest access my component 2 webinars. So that's webinars 3 and 4, and that's also on my website, and you can access them as you please, and you can go through the videos and go through the plans. So there are two options. Just download my plans if you feel fairly confident about component 2, and all you want are the plans attached to some of the essays we're going to talk about today. That's pretty good. That's what most of you probably will need. If you want to get further description, then download my webinars 3 and 4. And I think a lot of you have actually downloaded 3 and 4. And a lot of you have complimented it and said it's pretty good for your revision. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on component 2, UK government. I'm not going to look at the non-core ideas. And the plan for today is really go through what I think you should focus on in the coming week. You've got 1 week left until your second exam, what you should focus on, right? So here's the specification to do with constitution. And as you can see, you've got the nature and sources of UK constitution. You've got how the constitution has changed since 97. You've got devolution, and you've got debates about further reform to the constitution. So you've got these 4 areas, right, that you've got to focus on for constitution. Now, in terms of past questions, we've had basically a question here on devolution. We've had a question here about change. The UK constitution requires change. We've had a question here about devolution, and last year we had a question on devolution as well. If you ask me, now I can't be sure, and you can't hold me to this, but if you ask me, would there be a devolution question in this coming year, in this coming exam? I would say unlikely. Yeah, I can't say for sure. I would say that you probably do need to just make sure you revise devolution, and I have got a devolution plan in my pack, but I'm not going to say to you that make that your most immediate focus when it comes to constitution, because I've had 3 devolution questions so far, and they've had one on sort of the general reform to the constitution. So I have got this devolution essay in my plan, and I think it's important for the other questions, right? So if you were to be able to answer a reform question well, you probably would need to have information about devolution as one of your factors. So I would read through this plan in your own time. So for those of you who got the plans, just read through it. And I make a very important point here about the metro mayors. Not enough students talk about the metro mayors. So I think you need to be aware of what the metro mayors are and why they are and they are not. So, what's good about them and what's not so good about them. So for those of you, um, Ajay, I'm going to throw you out of this chats. Can you stop? I'm being quite serious now, right? Can you guys be focused and stop just throwing in, nonsense on the chat, because it's distracting me, but also I can't read then the questions that other people are asking. So I'm not going to go for feminism today. I'm just going to focus on the thing. So Hannah, Ajay, you're on the verge of being kicked out of this call, because I do want there to be focus. So please stop with the nonsense and let's focus on today. Right. Okay, and Amir, same for you. I know, you're responding to someone, but let's just focus now, right? So, okay. So you need to know about metro mayors, and I think if you get a question about reform, then you do need to know about, the devolution. In particular, the Labour Party wants to devolve, wants there to be deeper devolution, and so you do need to know about that, right? Okay, so now when it comes to constitution, I think the classic question on this question about there are more advantages of having a codified constitution than remaining with an uncodified constitution could come up, right? So I think this is a possible essay that could come up. It's a classic question. You may have probably studied it in your class. So, you may have done a test essay of it already. But if you haven't done so, I would suggest that you do that. I would suggest that you write this essay out in full, because I think it's quite an important essay. And of course, the question requires you to understand what is the value of having a codified constitution versus an uncodified constitution, right? Now, I'm not going to, this PowerPoint, Michelle and the rest of you that asked about this PowerPoint, you can actually purchase the plans in full from my website. So if you go to my website, you'll be able to get it. It's a very cheap price. It's a few pounds. Those of you who have access to plans say they're really good. So my advice to you, I will put the link in the chat later on. My advice to you is just get hold of that, because I'm not going to be able to go through each and every plan in great detail. But if I was to answer this question, I've got an example of an introduction here. And again, that's available in those plans on my website. But if I was to answer this question, I probably would divide the question up into 3 areas. And I would talk about how a codified constitution protects rights versus how it doesn't protect rights, or how rights are better protected with an uncodified constitution. I would say that a codified constitution places powers in the hands of an impartial judiciary, and I think that's a really good second point, that judges are better at looking after our rights, looking after or securing the constitution than politicians. And then I would counter that by saying that, but that's why we elect politicians. Elected politicians are accountable and judges are not accountable. So you got your second point. And then the third point, I would say the reason why a codified constitution is good is because it clarifies the roles and the powers of the prime minister. And for those of you who studied the prime minister well, you would know that there are too many conventions linked to the power of the prime minister and the role of the prime minister. And so, an example of that is if you think about Tony Blair, he broke the convention of the way in which cabinet should run. according to according to convention, cabinet the way it's run is through collective votes. So, if you have a particular policy or an issue going through cabinet, then it's a responsibility of all of the cabinet to vote on it, and the majority decision is what becomes a majority decision. Guys, I'm not actually going to look at the questions anymore because it's just getting too it's like giving me vertigo. So you can type away as you want, but I'm just going to focus on these. And then at the very end of Constitution, I will take your questions, right? So if you're writing a question now for me, I'm not going to answer it. Okay. And so it clarifies the role of the executive. That's the role of that's a codified constitution, like in the United States. The counter argument to that is that it's better to have a nimble system, a system which is flexible when it comes to the role of the executive. That way, the executive can deal with situations as and when they arise, right? And a good example of that, which I often mention to my students, is that, often when you think about the role of the executive, you realize that in the UK, there's a lot of leeway for the Prime Minister to, for example, set up new ministries, for example, the Brexit ministry, or to fold ministries, for example, the Ministry of International Development. At one stage, Boris Johnson set up the Ministry for Brexit Opportunities. And then when Rishi Sunak came in, he put that under the business department, right? So, there is a lot of flexibility when it comes to the way in which the executive is run in an uncodified constitution. So what I would do is I would argue the relative merits of a codified versus uncodified constitution in relation to the executive. Anyway, these are my three areas. I do detail these areas in a little bit more detail in my plans. There's a lot more there. But as I said, for time's sake, I'm not going to be able to do that today. Right. The second question that I think is really important is this one here. Evaluate the view that the UK Constitution is in urgent need of reform. That hasn't come up recently. And I think it's a very valid question to ask, right? And again, the way I've approached it is to say that the reforms that are required are parliamentary reform, entrenchment. Actually, I could call that codification. Let's call that codification. So parliamentary reform, codification, and devolution. These are the reforms that are in urgent need. We need, in other words, more parliamentary reform. So I detail in my plans Commons and Lords reform. We need more Commons and Lords reform. We need codification, and we need deeper devolution. For those of you who have been following the Labour Party, Keir Starmer has announced that when he comes to office, or if he comes to office, he's going to roll out greater devolution. So he's going to make, for example, English devolution much more deeper. He's going to give many more powers to Andy Burnham in Manchester, to the Liverpool, to the Teesside mayor. And he's going to broaden the mayoral system across England so that at the moment, only around 30% of England is under a mayor. What he wants to do is he wants that to envelop most of England. And so the good people of Hertfordshire or Bedfordshire will then get access, would have their own mayors, for example. So he wants to deepen devolution. My argument here is that these are probably the urgent reforms that are required. Parliamentary reforms, reforms to the Commons and the Lords, entrenchment with codification, and devolution, a deeper devolution, right? I think these are pretty important. Okay. Okay. So wonderful. Okay. And then I detailed all of these in greater detail in my plans. Right. Now, this is a tougher one. Evaluate the view that since 2010, constitutional reform has not gone far enough, right? They can ask you a question just about 2010. So there you wouldn't be able to talk about devolution in terms of Scotland and Wales, but you would be able to talk about the metro mayors because most of the metro mayors came after 2010. In that question, you wouldn't be able to talk about House of Lords reform in 1999 because that was, of course, during the Blair era. in 99. You wouldn't be able to talk about that, but you would be able to talk about the 2014 and 2015 reforms to the House of Lords. Again, if you don't know about those, you can either research it or I have detailed it in those plans, right? Um, in an essay like this, you would be able to talk about Brexit, because Brexit is another constitutional reform. So it's a trick. It's a really tough essay. You have to prepare for it, because if you don't prepare for a 2010 one, they have already asked an executive question from 2010. I think this is a very likely question, and I would suggest to you that make sure you prepare for a 2010 constitutional reform question, because they believe that most students are going to talk about are going to know about the 97 reforms, but not necessarily the more recent conservative reforms. So again, that's quite important. And then here's the tougher one, which you still can get, right? A question about evaluate the view that constitutional reforms since 2015 have not gone far enough. And again, you have to prepare for this question. Now, let me give you my plan for this question. I think the way you can do this is you can talk about Brexit. So Brexit is a major constitutional reform. You can talk about the constitutional reform since 2015 to the devolution, and I've got that here in the panel. And then you can talk about the reforms that are already been made to rights and the government's intention to repeal the Human Rights Act, which Dominic Raab, the former Justice Secretary, wanted to do. And how these reforms have impacted our rights, which are very much to do with constitution, right? So prepare for a 2015, a 2010 question, and a general question about constitutional reforms. If you ask me, if you get a general question about constitutional reforms, so constitutional reform since 97 has not gone far enough, I would talk more about these things rather than talk about the labor reforms, because I think you'll get its added value. These are contemporary examples. I think if you talk about the 97 examples, they're old school and that's textbook, and most people talk about those, whereas these are pretty good examples. I would certainly talk about the metro mayors. I think that's a really good post-2010 example. I think if you were to do that, it would, remember, a level 5 essay is really an essay that has sophisticated examples, so examples that are not in the textbook, sophisticated analysis, so analysis that goes beyond just sort of basic surface level analysis. And again, if you want to know about analysis on YouTube, I've got a video which talks about how to answer a 30 marker, and I detail how to do analysis in great detail in that. And lastly, you've got to have AO3 judgment throughout your essay. I think AO3 judgment is really easy to do. It's not a difficult thing to do. So my advice to you is have good contemporary examples and have good, solid analysis. And this really would tick the box for contemporary examples. So when it comes to constitution, I would say that uncodified versus codified is probably a strong focus of mine. I would say constitutional reform is another focus of mine, but think about constitutional reform since 2010, 2015. Right. I'm going to take some questions here. So I've just been ignoring your questions. So I have no idea what you guys have been asking. So I'm going to go to Maisie here, who's asked a sensible question. Freddie, stop spamming with nonsense, please. Bailey, yes, I do love the Metro Mayors. I think they're really good. Maisie's question, for the reform since 2010, 2015, can you still talk about other parts such as recalls? Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about recalls. If you have enough information about recalls, so recalls, of course, happened in 2015. So that would tick the 2015 box, wouldn't it? And the 2010 box. So if you have enough detail about recalls, yeah, I think that's really good. I think I would talk about that. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay, so I'm just going through your questions so far. What is a metro mayor? Okay, LJ, I'm not going to be able to explain metro mayors and Selena in great depth now, right? But a metro mayor is a mayor that's like Sadiq Khan in London, a mayor that's responsible for certain policy areas in their cities and the wider areas. So, for example, look at the example of the Manchester Metro Mayor, Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham is responsible for the Greater Manchester area, and at the moment, for example, Andy Burnham has responsibility over transport, which none of the other metro mayors have, by the way. And so he has nationalised the transport system across Manchester, and he's effectively established a TfL, the Transport for London system in Manchester, right? You've got 9 metro mayors. Actually, you've got 8 metro mayors, and there is a ninth, but don't worry about that. It's not quite a metro mayor, but you've got 8 metro mayors at the moment in the UK, and these metro mayors have a number of responsibilities. Anyway, I talk about that in my plans, but I hope that quick summary is sufficient. But so it's a conservative devolution. It's a conservative form of devolution. Good. Okay. Yes. Okay. Right. So I'm now shadow banning people, by the way. So those people who raise silly points, I'm just going to get rid of them. I don't know. For constitutional reform, Ralph, would just preparing for the 2015 question have you covered if you have asked about? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Ralph has got a good point. I think if you just focus on the 2015 question, then obviously you've covered reform since 97, haven't you? So that's really good. Yeah, I would go with that. Um, yeah, Harry's point is very good. Is the counterpoint to metro mayors that you only have 9? Well, yes, that is a good counterpoint, but also it doesn't cover most of England, right? So it only covers around 30% of England. Also, I would argue that they don't have enough powers, right? So these metro mayors have nowhere near the amount of powers that Sadiq Khan has in London, but also these metro mayors have no power. They have different powers. So it's what we call asymmetrical devolution. So the metro mayor for Sheffield has less powers than the metro mayor for Manchester, and none of them have the same powers as the mayor of London, right? So these are all reasons why the mayoral system is it's a hodgepodge of a system, and it needs to be sorted out. My view is that the Labour devolution plans are quite sensible, actually. Keir Starmer's plan is to roll out more metro mayors, right? And I think that's probably a good idea. Okay. Right, just going through your questions. Could we talk about the Fixed Term Parliament Act and how it was repealed? Yeah, that's good. That's a constitutional reform. I would talk about that in a broader sense. I would say Fixed Term Parliament is part of Commons reform, and then within Commons reform, I would talk about the right reforms, for example, of 2010. I would talk about the problems in the House of Commons, and the problem is that the executive dominates the House of Commons, right? I would certainly talk about that. Elzo, what replaced evil? Nothing replaced evil. Evil was removed, and now we've just got the old system back again. Okay. Labour cooking something special up. Excellent. Can we talk about Bill of Rights, even though it hasn't happened? Yeah, let me say a few words about the Bill of Rights, because I do talk about them in my plan. So the Conservative plan at the moment is still to get rid of the Human Rights Act and to replace it with a Bill of Rights. Now, with the departure of Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, it seems that the government may have given up on getting rid of the Human Rights Act, although they haven't explicitly stated that yet. So you can still talk about it. They want to replace it with a Bill of Rights. Now, a Bill of Rights would be a more specific set of rights. So, for example, at the moment, you may have the right to a family life. What the government wants to do is get rid of the room for interpretation, and so have less judicial interpretation. So the Bill of Rights will be much more specific, right? And the Bill of Rights will be a British Bill of Rights. And so potentially foreign citizens like migrants will not fall under the British Bill of Rights. So it will be very specific for British citizens rather than migrants, for example. So my feeling is that uh, a um, a British Bill of Rights, if it does go through, would severely reduce rights in the UK. I mean that's probably true. Okay. Uh, uh, could you say that because it was a conservative form of devolution, that I've lost the question. Sorry. No, 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 I've lost it. Sorry, that was a good question there, and it sort of scrolled away. Um, and, uh, okay, I'm just hiding another user from the channel. You could come up with logic. Yeah, I'm going to come back to the EU in a second, Harry. So I'll come back to EU membership because I think there will be an EU question possibly this year. Um, Aisha, when talking about further devolution to devolved bodies, would we mention the metro mayors within that? Yes, you would. Exactly. What other right reforms? So the right reforms were introduced in 2010. And the main bit of the right reforms were the two bits were that select committee chairs and select committee members are now going to be elected, but also the right reforms introduced the backbench business committees, right? So again, it will take me 40 minutes or half an hour to talk about the right reforms. I can't do that here, but that sort of gives you a quick understanding, Selena. Good question. Um, can you talk about a combustion rate of noise and the link to component free for that? I don't know what you mean, look, by combustion rate of the 9/11 situation. Wait, let's have a look. Yeah, Devon. So the Grand Committee stage introduced by Cameron, that's been removed. Boris Johnson got rid of that. That's part of evil. He got rid of it. So that no longer stands. But you can still talk about it. Okay, Daniel, you're out. Okay. Okay, what else have we got here? Yes. Synoptic links, Anna. Yeah. Synoptic links are quite good, important. So a synoptic link with here would simply be, for example, a link to component one. Conservatives believe in uncodified constitutions. Liberals believe in codified constitution. That's a synoptic link, right? So you can make a quick synoptic link about how conservatives view uncodified and how liberals view codified constitutions. I think that would be sufficient. Good. So I haven't come to sovereignty yet. So why are we asking about that? How life peers are expected to remain. Yeah, Ajay, you could probably talk about the life peers remaining. I think that's good. Yeah, you can talk about that. Elul, it's as long as I probably an hour and a half and then I'll stop. But you can always watch this later on. Okay, excellent. All right, I'm gonna carry on. Right, I'm gonna give you an outsider question which could come up. This hasn't come up yet, right? But it is in the spec, and you have to be able to answer this question. You have to be able to prepare for it. I can't say for you for sure it will come up, but what I do know is that a lot of students they don't prepare for the full spec. So this is the most difficult of the Constitution questions. Evaluate the view that parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law has been undermined in recent years. Parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law has been undermined in the recent years. Okay. Okay. So I think that's a really good question. And Zane, just mention. Oh yeah, you mentioned about the public order bill. That's good. Thank you for answering that. Good. Okay. So I think this is a very possible question. I don't know if it will come up this year, but it's one of those questions that hasn't yet been asked, right? Now, those of you who study law may know what the rule of law is. Parliamentary sovereignty is pretty simple. Parliamentary sovereignty is the idea that no parliament is bound by the decisions of a previous parliament, right? So an example of parliamentary sovereignty would be the repeal of evil. Evil was introduced by David Cameron, and then Boris Johnson comes along and gets rid of evil. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act was introduced by David Cameron. Boris Johnson comes along and he gets rid of evil, right? So evil is an example of and Fixed Term Parliaments Act example of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, rule of law is the idea that everyone is equal in front of the law, and the law applies to everyone in a blind way. So you don't have the law applies differently to ethnic minorities to that of white people, or to rich people to that of poor people. The law should apply neutrally to everyone, right? And that's the idea of the rule of law, that everyone is subject to the law. Now, this question, I think, is very much a potential to come up. It may come up as a source question because they may feel that you need a bit of a hand to find your points. I did plan this question, and I planned it like this. And again, you can just snapshot it and look at it later. I'm not going to go through that plan in great detail. But you have got Parliament, the rule of law, and rights. Parliament, the rule of law, and rights, right? So when it comes to so if we go back to the question, parliamentary sovereignty and rule of law has been undermined. Well, Parliament has been undermined in recent years by a number of things that have happened. In particular, where Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, and when Theresa May triggered Article 50. So my argument here is that Parliament has been deeply undermined in recent years, right? The rule of law has also been undermined, and I'll go through a number of arguments as to why it's been undermined in recent years. In particular, if you think about during COVID, Partygate, it's an example of how the rule of law has been jeopardized, right? And then lastly, rights. Rights has been undermined in recent years, and it's all of those discussions we had about rights before can be brought in here, and I've got examples of rights, and then we can argue that with the fact that our rights are still very strongly protected, and there are some examples of that on that slide. Okay, so that's my basic approach to that question. I mean, prepare for it. Write a detailed plan in your own words, and make sure you're ready for this question. Right. Okay. Okay. Excellent. So Evie, you've now been shadow banned as well. Excellent. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, Elsa, can you talk about the 2022 Police Crime Commissioners and 2023 Public Order Bill about protest rights? Yeah, I think I will talk about that. Yeah, there are good examples of the reversal of rights. Okay, so that's Constitution. So in summary, I think you've got that outsider question, but I think you should revise reforms, certainly, and you should refine codified and uncodified questions. And I think that should be a focus. I wouldn't discount devolution. It can come up, right? Surely it can come up. So just make sure you can answer a devolution point. But if you're thinking, look, I haven't done much revision for Constitution, I would go with those questions first and then move on to devolution. Right. Good. Excellent. All right. Any questions here? Do you think it's likely that there will be? So I haven't started Parliament yet. So why are you asking about Parliament Unknown 12? What a name. What a name, Unknown 12. Okay, excellent. Harry, could you talk about devolution? Yeah, you probably could in answer to that question. Yeah, you probably could weave it in. I think that's quite good. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. It's a difficult question. You're right. It is a difficult question. Yeah, Aisha, you could talk about parliamentary privilege. Yeah, maybe that's a good thing to talk about. If you know about it, that's good. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Uh, let's then move on. Lewis has asked the question, how important are synoptic links and how much detail should we include in an essay? To answer that question, just look at my video on the front page of my website on 30 markers, and I talk about those 2 points. So I'm not going to repeat myself here, right? Um, uh, yeah, Ellie, if constitutional reform in general comes up, would you do one paragraph on each, 97, 2010, and 2015? No, because of course those dates are not like, it's not as if all the reforms happened in 97. So you're saying like all the constitutional reforms after 97, after 2010, after, I wouldn't do that. I think you could easily divide it up into parliamentary reforms, devolution reforms, and reforms to rights, or Brexit, or something like that. I mean, if the more you can thematically put things together, the better the answer is, to be honest. So I probably would go with that rather than go with your way. Okay. Excellent. So fantastic. Yes. Yeah, Zena, can you explain how rights link to the former question? Well, rights link to the former question in the sense that when we talk about the rule of law, of course, if you don't have access to rights, then the rule of law will be undermined, right? The rule of law will be severely undermined. Um, and so, for example, I'll give you a good example of this. Legal aid, which is free legal services if you don't have the money for it. Legal aid was reduced quite severely under under the Cameron government, right? So it was David Cameron who reduced legal aid. Now you can say that that's a reduction of rights. You no longer have access to the judiciary. And in fact, it was Lord Neuberger, who was the then president of the Supreme Court, who said that this will severely undermine the rule of law. Yeah. Okay. So excellent. Samuel White, goodbye. You are going to be put into timeout, Samuel. Right, so separation of powers, model plan. Excellent. Thank you. Wonderful. Excellent. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Let's talk about Parliament now. Now, Parliament, there's a number of areas. You've got the structure of the Lords and the House of Commons. That's one section, and how that sort of functions. You've got the comparative powers of the Commons and the Lords. You've got the legislative process, which came up last year, by the way. And then you've got the ways in which Parliament interact with the executive, right? So, as I said, past questions, you've had a question about whether the Lords needs more reform, or the Lords works better in practice than the Commons, right? So that was a question that came up. You've got a question here, using the source, evaluate the view that the principal role of backbench MPs is now to hold the government to account. So that was a something about backbenchers. You had a question here about the House of Lords and the membership. So it's basically Lords reform. And then you had a question here about the legislative process. Last year, by the way, we planned this question almost word for word, and I've left the plan in my pack of plans. But this question did sort of come up, and the students were really able to answer that question really well, right? So my view is this year, and there are some list of possible questions for Parliament. My view is that this year, backbenchers have come up, so I wouldn't focus too much on backbenchers, although you probably do need to have a good answer to backbenchers, and I've got a really good answer here to backbenchers, but it has come up before. I think you could get a specific question on select committees. Now that will be a disaster for some of you because you don't have enough information about select committees, right? So my advice to you is plan a detailed question on select committees, because that could come up. That's a very important question. Now, I have got a plan to that question, and I'll give you a very basic idea of the plan with an introduction. I argue that you could probably talk about the common select committees since the right reforms, and how they become more bipartisan and how they become more independent. So you have one section on Commons committees since 2010, the right reforms, right? Um, then you can talk about you could talk about um, um, common select committees and their role in appointments, right? So there is another role of select committees, and that's what we call appointments to public positions. For example, Ofsted and Ofqual. And I go into this in a lot of detail in my webinars, how to answer that question. But my advice to you is that know how the Common Select Committee is responsible for select for within select committees. I'm really tired today, actually, within select committees, right? And then the last thing is Lord's select committees. And again, not enough students know about Lord's select committees. And so my advice to you is talk about Lord's select committees there. AJ has raised a point about the liaison committee. Maybe you can talk about the liaison. I would put liaison committee under common select committees probably, but you can probably talk about liaison committees. Okay, excellent. Rocco is gone. Wonderful. Petitions committee. Yeah, you could talk about petitions committee. I don't think you can write an entire section on petitions committee. So my advice is probably put that under select committees, right? But yeah, I think select committees could come up as a question, and that's how I would do it, right? As my three sections. Okay. Okay. Oh, Hannah, you couldn't find a Maldives example online. Take it from me. It was Channel 4. Google it. So, Hannah, you were probably in my webinar when I talked about it. You had the Environment Select Committee of the House of Lords who went on a fact-finding mission to the Maldives, And Channel 4 did a sting operation where they basically said these guys gave a speech, like they went to a conference for half a day, and then for the rest of the week, they were lounging on the beach. And that's an example of maybe the way those Lord Select committees work, right? Yeah, good, AJ. These are good points. Okay, good. Yeah, fantastic. So select committees. And again, I've got a detailed plan to that question. Oh yeah, in fact, I've got these case studies from common select committees, which I think will be quite useful for those of you who don't have enough case studies. So there's a great, the Home Affairs Select Committee and the Windrush scandal. I would highly advise you, but you can get these case studies off thing. I've also got a good section on Lord Select committees and what they've managed to do. So I would again highly recommend that. Right. I think this is also a very probable question. Adam, Zhao, I've planned all the essays in component 2 from your webinar, and there isn't an essay about Lord's reform. Do you think it's unlikely to come up? No, I don't think it's unlikely to come up, Adam. I think there could be a Lord's reform. All I'm saying, there was a Lord's reform very recently, wasn't there? But I can't be sure. I think you should plan it at least. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You should plan a Lord's reform question. Although I don't focus on it. I do focus on it within the Constitution topic. I don't focus on it because I think it's probably won't come up. Maybe won't come up, right? Okay. Evaluate the view that the opposition is effective in the House of Commons, right? So that's a very valid question. By opposition, we mean the Labour Party, but also we can also mean the other parties, in particular the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, right? And I think that's a really valid question. I think it's a very important question to ask. Okay, good, Sam, that you're being good. Sam, you're not being good, and you start talking about Freddie. Sam, you're the annoying kid in the class, Sam. I need to kick you. I need to kick you out. I need to send you to the head of year, and not have to deal with you. Right. AJ, thank you for that answer. Good. Excellent. Okay. So that's a possible question. Yeah, actually the way I answer it is I talk about the legislative process in the first point. So how effective the opposition is in the legislative process. I talk about how the opposition is at PMQs and urgent questions, and then how the opposition act in the select committees, right? So I think these are all three very good examples. Hannah, email me. I'll see if I can find that example for you. Um, okay, so I think that's how you would answer the opposition question. Please prepare for an opposition question. I think it's very possible that that could come up. Zachariah, don't be scared about paper 2. If you could go through these plans, and I'm telling you, you'll be able to answer these questions very competently. So don't worry too much about it. Anyway, I've got a detailed plan to that. This is a question which came up last year in a different way. So I've left it into in my plans because I think it's a good question, and it's a very realistic question. So yes, I think that's good. Excellent. Okay. And yeah, and I go through the answer to that question there. Right. I think this is also another really important question that I think you should be able to answer. Evaluate the view that the House of Commons is in urgent need of reform. The House of Commons is in urgent need of reform. Yeah. And it's not about the Lords. It's specifically about the House of Commons. And again, not enough students know what the problems are with the House of Commons. So my 3 areas would be the Commons and the legislative process and what the problems are in the legislative process, the Commons and scrutiny and accountability and the problems and the positives about scrutiny and accountability, and then the Commons when it comes to representation. So these would be my 3 sections in an essay about the Commons needs urgent reform. Again, if they've had a House of Lords reform question, they haven't yet had a House of Commons reform question. I think it's possible that a House of Commons question would come up, right? So again, prepare for a House of Commons question. I think it's an important question. So as a summary, before I take your questions on Parliament, I think that you could get a question on select committees. I think that's a very possible question. I think backbenchers, revise it, but I'm not sure. It came up fairly recently, so you probably won't get a backbenchers question. You could do, I suppose, but revise it. But I think you could get a question on select committees and the effectiveness of select committees on their own. Okay, I think you could get a question about the opposition. I think that's a really valid question to be asked. I think you can get a question about, well, not the legislative process because that did come up last year. I think you get a question about Commons reform. So do prepare for those questions, right? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so let me just take your quick questions. Selena, my teacher missed 3 months when we... Oh, wow. Okay. And then you deleted that question. Could we talk about devolution in this question? Sorry, when you say this question, if you mean the Commons is in need of reform, no, you couldn't talk about devolution in a Commons question. I don't think you could. I don't think that would be a valid question. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you may hope that someone just said, I think these are vague questions, MA, and you think Edexcel will be nice this year. I hope so. I don't think they're vague questions. I think they're very standard questions. I think I think these are very basic questions, to be honest. The questions on Commons reform, whatever. I don't believe that these are vague, like fringe questions. I think these are really central questions, to be honest. Mill, when answering a question, did you say a thematic approach was better? In the paper 1 referendum question, I split my paragraphs based on individual. No, I think with referendums, I did say that that's probably the best way to do referendums. So don't worry about that. I'm just saying that if it's an easy thematic way, then do that. Otherwise, dates are quite good. And I do say that for component 1 in particular. Okay. Okay, excellent. Fantastic. Made to Lord. What were the changes made to the Lords in 2014 and 2015? So a summary, Before 2014 and 15, a lord couldn't retire. You couldn't get rid of a lord if they did wrong, right? And if a lord didn't turn up, you couldn't do anything about that. After 2014 and 15, lords could now retire. The House could vote to get rid of or suspend a lord, and lords had to turn up on a regular basis, otherwise they would be thrown out of the House of Lords, right? So these were the reforms that were introduced in 2014 and 15. Okay. Okay, do you think we can get a question on the PM active presidential? I haven't come to PM yet. Aisha, why are you asking about the PM? Could you talk about the nature of parliamentary sovereignty need and reform as it doesn't protect rights in this question? Maybe, Noah, maybe. I do sort of like that, but I think you need to establish why that's connected to the question. But I see where you're going there. I do like that. Okay. Zachariah, could you talk about diversity of the PM as a counter to reform in the House of Lords? Maybe so. So you're meaning like not just the PM, but the front bench today has, a lot of diversity. Maybe so in terms of representation. Yes, you can. Grace, could you get a question just on how Parliament is good at representation? I suppose you can, Grace. I think that would be an unfair question. Yeah, I think that would be an unfair question. But I suppose you can, couldn't you? But what would you write? I don't know if I could write enough about that. What electoral system? When talking about House of Commons reform, what electoral system reform would be included? So you could say that the first past the post system could be replaced by proportional representation. And again, that's a good synoptic link to the other thing. Excellent. Is 2 years ago. I don't compare AJ to Alan History Nerd. I'm sorry, but I bow to Alan History Nerd's, enthusiasm. He's great, So I'm afraid I'm second to Alan History Nerd. Can House of Commons reform include changing the electoral system? It probably can. I wouldn't make electoral system the main thing in that House of Commons reform, but I think you could talk about that. Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to do a USA one, I'm afraid. I don't have time to do a USA one this year. House of Commons reform. Yeah. Yeah, everyone's asking about first past the post. Excellent. Yeah, that's interesting, Emily. You've got some interesting points there. So as I said, my points would be these 3 points, but you could raise your own points. That's perfectly fine. Excellent. Okay. So we've got that. Okay, so that's basically my predictions or my focus for, I shouldn't say predictions, my focus for Parliament, right? So let's now talk about relations between the branches. Excellent. Yes. Yeah, Noah. Yeah, I think you can talk about lobbying. Yeah, I think you're right. You can talk about lobbying, can't you, for House of Commons reform? Yeah, I didn't think of that, but I think you can talk about lobbying. That's perfectly fine. Excellent. Well, with USA, for those of you who are asking about USA, I have done a USA Contemporary Examples webinar. It was actually an entire revision day at King's College. So that's available on my website. You can access that. And for global also, I did a global session. And again, it was like 5 hours long. I did a global session. And again, that's available on my website. So I probably will stick with that. I may do a global, because I have taught you recently. So I may do a global plans paper. Yeah, I might do that. Like just the plans and just send them out, put them on my website. Yeah, maybe look on my website for tomorrow. I might get that out. Do any of you live in Haywards Heath? Like I'm going tomorrow to Haywards Heath College to do a revision session. So I get hired by schools to do revision sessions. And I'm going to Haywards Heath tomorrow. it seems like a far off place. I've never been to Haywards Heath. Anyway, so yeah, global. I may do something for global. Exactly. Let's talk about relations between the branches, right? Uh, I haven't done an essay plan for USA, and I just don't have the time now. I've got to do so much in this next few weeks. I don't have the time to do a USA plans, I'm afraid. Maybe next year if you're resitting. Sorry, that's very cruel. So great. Oh, Hannah, you're from Haywards Heath. Fantastic. Ayala, you're from Haywards. Oh, that's good to hear. All right, so Hannah, just I will be there next year. Your whole family are from Haywards Heath, Rahul. Come to Mill Hill, please. They've got to hire me. They've got to give me the big bucks, and then I'll like Hayward Heath, and then I'll come to Mill Hill. Can you talk about whips in House of Commons reform? Yes, I put that under legislative reform. I put whips under reform to the legislative process. So yes, I would do that. Okay, excellent. Here you see your plans. Yeah, Bayan, you've just purchased the wrong essay plans. You've purchased component 1, not 2. So just send me an email and I'll send you the link to component 2. You've just clicked on the wrong one. So, that's a thing. All right, excellent. So there's a bit of a delay here. So obviously I'm getting all of the Hayward Heath points. Can we get a room tour, sir? How much do I cost to hire? Well, you got to look at my Mercedes. I don't have a Mercedes, actually, to be able to answer that question. I drive a Volvo. It's a pretty boring car. Yes. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about relations between the branches. Now, this is the area that I think you could get some possible difficult questions, right? So there's this whole Supreme Court thing. I just don't think you're going to get Supreme Court this year. You may get Supreme Court. I could be wrong, right? But I don't think you're going to get Supreme Court this year. Okay. Because, and I'll explain why, because there've been too many Supreme Court questions. Possibly you could get it. They may decide they're going to do, a Supreme Court question again. So revise it, but I don't think you're going to get it. I think your most likelihood is you'll get questions in these two blocks. They did ask an EU question in 2019. So possibly you can get a repeat of EU, or you can get location of sovereignty within the UK system. I will put my bets on these two. I can't discount these two, right? But I would probably say you'll get a question in these two areas, right? Now, with European unions, a lot of students are under the misnomer, the misunderstanding that the EU has been taken out. It hasn't, right? The EU remains as a topic. What they've done is they've changed the EU section. You no longer need to know about the way the EU make laws, but what you need to know about is the impact of leaving the EU on UK parliamentary sovereignty. I think that's a really important question, and that could come up. There's now been a good number of years since the 2016 referendum, so it's very possible it could come up, right? Or you could get a question about the location of sovereignty. But again, as I said, I'm not convinced that look, you've had a EU question there. You had a Supreme Court, and a Supreme Court question. They've asked the 3 major questions on the Supreme Court. I can't think of any more questions on the Supreme Court. Now, they may be kind, and they may go back to this. They may go back to the Supreme Court's influence. And I do have an essay on that, right? But my hunch is that you may not get a Supreme Court question, as I said. So it may be an EU question this year, right? And I do want to spend a bit of time just going through that. So, and I've got some possible questions here about the EU. So this is my EU question. I don't know if they will phrase it like this, but evaluate the view that leaving the EU has decisively returned sovereignty back to the UK Parliament, has brought sovereignty back to the UK Parliament, right? And good. So, Bayan, you can just go on my website and go to contact us, and then you will see contact us, and then you can email me, right? Excellent. Okay. So, evaluative view that leaving the EU has decisively returned sovereignty to the UK. Now, my view is that you can answer this question by saying parliamentary sovereignty hasn't fully returned to to the UK because of the status of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland remains part of the EU and remains subject to the European Court of Justice, right? So you could talk about Northern Ireland as a problem because parliamentary sovereignty doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, right? In a fuller sense. And there's been a whole discussion, and again, I spent probably a good 45 minutes to an hour going through this in my webinar 4. So I can't really do that today. But if you know a bit about Northern Ireland, you'll be able to answer this question. I would say that much of EU law remains part of UK law. So at the moment, there are 4,000 bits of EU legislation that remain part of UK law, right? In answering that question about whether EU law or sovereignty has returned, you would say, well, surely not. You have lots of laws that remain that remain EU laws, right? And the EU wants it that way because according to EU, you want to have as less friction of trade between the UK and the EU as possible. And so that's why the UK has had to sort of mirror EU laws, right? Now, there's some discussion about getting rid of those laws. There was a bill that was going to be going to be passed, and then the government scrapped that bill. Okay. But you can still write about it because according to Rishi Sunak, he does want to ultimately get rid of those 4,000 laws, right? And then the last question is the government's attempt to undermine Parliament as a result of Brexit. So we can talk about triggering Article 50 and we can talk about proroguing Parliament. So Brexit was meant to return sovereignty to Parliament. Actually, what it's done, it's removed sovereignty from Parliament, right? Because the government has tried to undermine sovereignty. Now, Josh, you like this question. I suspect, Josh, you sat through my webinars on that question, webinar 4. So yes. Archie, where are the essay plan packs on my website? I will put it in the link at the very end. I'll send it to you at the very end. For the EU sovereignty question, can we still talk about the bill retained EU legislation? Yes, you can, because they're no longer happening, but they said they're going to still do it. They want to do it, but they want to do it later. The reason why, Chloe, they said they're not doing it is because the 31st of December is too soon, right? They still believe that they will do it sometime in the future. So they've still got that intention, Chloe. And by the way, even they scrapped the bill, but they said we're still going to get rid of some laws of the EU. We're just not going to get rid of all 4,000 of those laws at once. So they're weeding through those laws and they're trying to get rid of some of those laws, right? Would you be able to structure it EU devolution, HRA since devolution? HRA has prevented parliamentary sovereignty from returning. No, because the Human Rights Act, Maddie, is nothing to do with the EU. The Human Rights Act is something separate to the EU. And I'm not sure how you could link it to Brexit. So I don't know really. Yeah, I don't know really. And then we got Hughesy, who's just written something in Arabic, which makes no sense. Thank you, Old Wise Simba. It's a good point. And maybe I should kick out Hughesy. Yeah, no, I'm going to put him in timeout. Okay. Yes. Da, 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 da. Could you talk about the impact of the referendum, popular sovereignty, but then how the government has sovereignty over the deal? Yeah, Harry's got a good point. So for EU, could you talk about the impact of the referendum, popular sovereignty, but then how? Yeah, okay. I like that. I think you can talk about that. That's a neat point. That's not a point that everyone's going to get, but I think that's a good point, Harry. Yeah, I think you could talk about that. Yeah, excellent. You can't talk about ECHR, exactly. Yes, excellent. Brilliant. Okay. Fantastic. Yes, just going through your questions. Uh, excellent. Mary, this is so helpful. Fantastic. I'm glad. I'm glad you like it. But it's US version revision, revision for the US paper. No, Adam, I don't cover US questions in my revision, so no, it wouldn't be sufficient. I think I would say you probably do need to have, more. You need to go through essays, right? You need to plan essays for the USA. Um, Dakota, you're on the verge of being thrown out here. Let's focus. Excellent, Proker. Thank you very much. That's good to hear. Could you talk about how the UK still collaborates with the EU and its members over Ukraine? But that's what you would do anyway. Like the EU, UK collaborates with America over Ukraine. It doesn't mean our sovereignty has been reduced, right? Anyway, that collaboration is under NATO, and NATO is not, as you may know, NATO doesn't take away sovereignty from states, right? So I don't think you could talk about Ukraine. No, I wouldn't do that. HRI can be linked to Brexit as ECHR is incorporated into UK law. After Brexit, government doesn't have to follow ECHR. No, that's wrong. No, that's completely wrong, actually. They do have to follow ECHR. That's, you wouldn't, that's not correct at all. ECHR is separate to the European. Now, by the way, Dominic Raab did talk about diverging from the ECHR if he was to pass his replace the Human Rights Act with a Bill of Rights, right? But they haven't yet done that. So ECHR does apply to the UK, certainly does. And Brexit has nothing to do with the ECHR. Okay, I'm Shakespeare, but just for politics. Thank you. That's great to hear. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, good. So I'm going to move on. So that's the EU question, which I would advise you. Look, I think I've just gone through lots and lots of detail here. I mean, just look at, there is so much detail here on the EU that I wouldn't do it justice. It would take me an hour to go through it now. So I would suggest that you focus on it in your own time and you work through that. Excellent, Bayan. That's good to hear. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Lewis, why does it still apply? Well, because the European Court of Human Rights has nothing to do with the EU. That's why. It's a separate thing that was signed in the 1950s before the EU even existed. That's right. Okay. Can talk about Bojo proroguing Parliament. Yeah, exactly, Aisha. Bojo proroguing Parliament is exactly what I would talk about. Could a question on the EU versus UK judiciary come up? No, I don't think so. Could you say that leaving the EU hasn't solved issues such as devolution? I don't think there's a link between the EU and devolution, so I'm not sure you can talk about that. It's going to stay up on my YouTube channel. Yes, it is. Talia, sovereignty in practice is the government adhering to the people. So let me come to sovereignty. Right. Evaluate the view that the location of sovereignty has moved in recent years. So my plan for this question is that whole EU discussion. So you can transport the EU discussion from the previous essay into this and say that, yes, Brexit did return sovereignty to Parliament, and no, Northern Ireland remains in the EU. EU laws still remain on our statute book, and so you could say that the EU, that sovereignty hasn't, the location of sovereignty hasn't moved in recent years because the EU still has a lot of influence over British policy, over UK policy. You can say devolution, sovereignty has moved away to the metro mayors, but also more sovereignty has been given to Scotland and to Wales, for example. And then the counter argument to that, so you would need examples, and then the counter argument to that would be that, look, sovereignty hasn't returned, the location of sovereignty hasn't moved because the British government vetoed the trans rights bill. Sorry, what was it called again? The trans rights bill, the gender rights bill in Scotland, and didn't allow Scotland to introduce that, right? And that is an example of how Parliament still has sovereignty and central government still has sovereignty, right? And lastly, judiciary. The discussion about judiciary is simply that, has have judges taken more power away from Parliament and the executive? So have the judges done that? And in particular, the Human Rights Act gives judges the power to declare, to make declarations of incompatibility. So that has taken some sovereignty away from Parliament. Gender recognition bill. Thank you. Um, uh, and the counter argument to that is that Parliament is still sovereign, and again, they may get rid of the Human Rights Act, right? And so, it simply comes down to the fact that is the judiciary really, has it really taken away sovereignty from Parliament? Right. I haven't looked at any of your questions, so I'm going to look at your questions now on this topic. So a lot of questions about the gender recognition bill. Okay. Excellent. Amir, can you stop? Amir, I've got a problem because Amir writes some good things, and then he starts going on about fake Asians. Amir, that's a psychological problem. You need to get that seen, my friend. Right. Zahi, for devolution, can you talk about the Sewell Convention? It's not legally binding. Yeah, I would do that. That's a good, nice one, right? Do you think that Hearst versus UK is too old example? Probably so. Yeah, I think so. Can you argue about judicial act and illegal migration that eroded the Supreme Court? Yes. Yes, that's good, Cabbage. Yeah, that's good. How up to date are the revision plans? Very up to date, Jude. I wrote them this year. Or wrote most of them this year or some of them last year, but they're very up to date. I updated all of them this year, so you get very updated examples. How and why could you speak about the EU in this question? Well, in the sense that in the last question, we said that so much of the EU still applies to the UK. How can we really have sovereignty? For example, Parliament. For example, Northern Ireland still remains in the EU. Northern Ireland is part of the UK, right? Okay, perfect. Oh, come on. What a silly question to ask. Okay, Jude, excellent. Kiki, do you have to say where sovereignty was before and where it is now? You can say that, yeah. Could you say that it hasn't moved because it was always with Parliament? Yes, you can. That could be your judgment. That is my judgment. Kiki, you have got the prize. You've beaten Amir because Amir is just a joker now. Kiki's comment is the best comment of the day. You can say that. You can say that Parliament has always been sovereign, right? Now, Kiki, I'm going to do one better than you. I would say that actually, in reality, the executive is sovereign in the UK because the executive always has a majority. And when an executive has a majority, they can get anything past Parliament, right? So in reality, in the UK, the executive is dominant. The executive is sovereign, not Parliament. Parliament just has to abide by all the decisions of the executive as long as the executive has a majority in Parliament and can command its majority, right? So I think that's good, right? Yeah, Grace has got the fancy way of structuring the question: legal sovereignty, political and popular sovereignty. Yeah, I quite like that. Yeah, I think you can do that. I don't do that because I just find that those discussions quite boring. But Grace, you may find them really exciting, so you go for it. Yoni, I can't think of any other EU question, I'm afraid. I don't think they'll ever ask a question. I showed you. So if we go back to this box here, they've got a question here about the EU single market, the four freedoms. I don't think you'll get a question on this because that's not a British politics question. I think in answering this question, you should bring that in. So I think that if you think about it, that's the only question that can be asked for that bullet point: sovereignty in relation to the EU, right? So I personally think it would be a sovereignty question, and how they phrase it, I don't know. Sometimes I've been quite lucky in recent years in actually getting the phrasing right, but I don't. I'm doubtful that the phrasing would be exactly the same here. Jane, Could you say that leaving the EU hasn't returned sovereignty in regards to immigration, though we have more freedoms over immigration laws in practice? Recent figures show we don't. That's a really deep point. Yeah, I would bring that under. So if you're saying about sovereignty, I would bring that under the EU point. So I wouldn't make that a standalone point, but I would raise that as a good case study within my point. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Does Parliament decide a Barnett formula? Yeah, yeah, it does. Okay. Uh, any recent legal examples? I don't know what you mean, Hannah. But as I'm seeing you tomorrow, Hannah, you can ask that question tomorrow. Sorry, I've just skipped. Sorry, yeah, I'm just going back to my questions. Fantastic. I haven't got Nadine. I haven't got to Prime Minister yet, so I'm still getting to that. So wait, hold your horses. Uh, okay, excellent. AJ, AJ, I am gonna put you in timeout for that. That's not a very nice thing to say, AJ. Um, Aisha, for location of sovereignty and judiciary, what examples could you use? Could you mention Gina Miller? Yes, you can. And how she took the PMs to Supreme Court? Yes, you can. Yeah. And again, I do talk about the Gina Miller ones in my plans. In if you don't use contemporary examples, will you be capped? No, but I wouldn't give a level 5 to a student who doesn't use contemporary examples. Yeah, that's just my thinking. I would give a level 4, so, but I wouldn't give a level 5 to those who don't use contemporary examples. Right. Could you also mention Scottish independence and the Supreme Court rejecting another referendum linked to power of judiciary, or is that more of a devolution point? Yeah, that's a nice point. So if you're saying in relation to sovereignty, probably, yeah, I think you can make that link. Yeah, I think you can make that link. So yeah, can we explain legal and political sovereignty in relation to this question? Yes, you can. Yeah, and I think someone made that point previously. Okay. Judicial Reform Act 2022, they have more power on cases like immigration. Yes, that's okay. So you're answering the point. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So also, Northern Ireland is still in the EU. So what I mean by that, it's still in the single market of the EU. I should have said that. So I do talk about that in my webinar 4, but it's still in the single market. Yeah. So it's in a really important EU institution. Okay. Excellent. Scottish rejoin the EU to referendum. Noah, yeah, that's a good point about Scotland's desire to rejoin the EU. Rowan, should your conclusions give your opinion on the future, e.g., could change due to the calls for Scottish independence? Yeah, I like that. I talk about that, don't I, in my YouTube video, that you should always give a nod to the future. So I think that's good. Rowan, that's a really good point. Uh, uh, yeah. I haven't come to the PM yet, Aisha. Can you link synoptic links with first past the post? Yes, you can, Cabbage. Um, Excellent. Excellent. Kiki, how about globalization and sovereignty? Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, that's obviously a global politics point. So, I if you don't know about that, then I wouldn't talk about it. But yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so I'm just running through your comments. I don't understand. Um, Mariam, you don't understand the Northern Ireland slide. It's a long explanation, Mariam. Mariam, email me and I'll see if I can send you something to explain that a little further. Okay, so Abigail, thank you. That's good. Northern Ireland Protocol and parliamentary sovereignty. Can you explain? Yeah, so Abigail, again, maybe email me and I can probably give you a hand on that. But I think for now it's probably too much to go through that. Um, is the Human Rights Act the only protection for human rights in the UK? No, there are other protections. There's the Equalities Act 98 2008, for example, which is another form of that. Okay, wonderful. How many synoptic points should you make? I think just 3 would be enough. 3, 1 per paragraph, 1 per section would be sufficient. Samuel, you can contact me through my website. Just look at the contact us section. Okay, so and then yeah, I've talked about that. Right, so let's move on to another essay. Evaluate view that the UK Supreme Court is effective in checking the power of the government. I don't think this will come up. It can come up, but as I said, you've had 3 Supreme Court questions already, so I don't know. I don't think, but I know I've got a detailed plan to answer that. So should we go into the last section, the Prime Minister and the Executive, right? Also, if you don't know what a synoptic link is, go to my YouTube video and go back, which talks about 30 markers. You probably have to watch that, and I'll talk about synopticity. What's band 4 in terms of marks? I think a band 4 goes up to 22, 21. No, it's 23. I think it's 23. I think it's 17 to 23 or 18 to 23. Excellent. Okay, so you're all trying to answer that Northern Ireland point. Fantastic. Right, so let's go into the final one. I am running out of time. But let's go to the final section, and that's on the PM and the executive. So what should you focus on in this next week on the PM and the executive, right? So that's the thing. Last year, this question came up, which I did predict word for word, by the way, the concept of ministerial responsibility. And students were really happy about it because they came out of the exam just literally lifting my entire plan for that answer. I don't think it will come up this year. I don't think you'll get a CCR IMR question because it came up last year, right? So what could come up this year? These are the past questions. There was a question about the PM has too much power. There's a question about since 2010, there's been a return to cabinet government. There's a question about evaluate the view that since 2010, the executive has dominated parliament. And there was a question here about ministerial responsibility and collective responsibility, right? So these questions have come up in the past. Right, excellent. Yes, excellent. Good. Okay. So, evaluate the view that the Prime Minister has become all but president in name. I think that could come up. You know, a lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, that's just an obvious question. But the only near question you had was in 2019 on the power of the Prime Minister. I think this question is due. I think it's a good question. I think most of you would have written this question, wouldn't you? Most of you would have prepared this question. So I think it's a good question. I would answer it like this. This is too long of an introduction, by the way. I went overboard on this introduction. But I would say that, you know, you can say that cabinet has been undermined, the erosion of cabinet government. You can say that the Prime Minister has become more personalized, and you can say that the Prime Minister has played a more presidential role in things like foreign affairs. So that's probably how I would do that, right? That's probably how I do that. Okay. Again, I can't quite answer this question in great depth, or I can't give you the plan in great depth. But again, I do plan it. But you guys must have done this question in class. I mean, it's the basic question that teachers do when it comes to Prime Minister. Right. Evaluate the view that ministers are irrelevant, which is not too dissimilar to evaluate the view that the cabinet no longer remains an important body, which is not too dissimilar to evaluate the view that the cabinet government remains central to the working of the executive. So again, I plan this question and I say that, well, in fact, let me give you the plan. So evaluate the view that the cabinet is no longer remains an important body. I say that prime ministers undermine cabinet, they sideline cabinet. I talk about how the cabinet ministers are ill-qualified and dependent on the prime minister for position. And lastly, I talk about how cabinet ministers no longer resign on principle to keep their jobs. So I talk about these 3 sections. You can look at these, you can take a snapshot of this and look at it in your own time. Okay. Oh, Alan, History Nerd, predicted this too. Very good. Very good. So that's good to hear. It's good to hear that Alan, I always take my hat off to Alan, also predicted this question. Great. Um, is there a chance the question might come up about to what extent PMs are? Oh, I've answered that already, Sophie. The presentation is available. Well, the YouTube is available afterwards, if that's what you mean, Rio. Yes. Could you ask what extent the PM, the main sources of the executive power? What is personalization? So personalization is where everything comes down to the prime minister, and that usually is because of media and the 24 hours media. You forget about the team. You forget about the fact that you've got a cabinet and you just focus on one person, and that's the prime minister. So there's been a personalization, and it really started probably with Margaret Thatcher. It became more of an issue under Tony Blair, and nowadays it's okay, AJ is completely banned. Okay, excellent. Right. So goodbye, AJ. It was bad knowing you. Right. So AJ's gone. Right. Um. Yeah. Excellent. So I think I've answered the politicization. Emily, do you like the A-level politics show? I think I haven't really heard it. I'm afraid, Emily. It's been a while since I did hear it a few years back. I think it's, anything that politics teachers do will be really good. So I think it, and I've heard of students say that they've looked at a particular episode and they really did like it. So yeah, I think that's good. Um, I think it is good to talk about the most recent prime minister. Yeah, I would talk about Rishi Sunak a lot in that essay. Um, Noah, can you link to the media coverage of the Prime Minister, such as leadership debates and specific examples such as Brown saying bigoted woman? Yes, I will talk about that. Okay. Could you talk about special advisors and the Downing Street machine for this question? Yes, you can. And I put that into the first section, actually, Prime Minister's sidelining the cabinet. So that's very good. Kiki, could you say leaving the EU as a counter-argument to PM control in terms of foreign policy and also Parliament convention to vote on foreign policy? There is no convention to vote on foreign policy. I've heard some teachers say that doesn't exist. There's no convention. It's still a prerogative power of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister can call military action without going to Parliament, right? There is no convention to do that. Certainly there isn't. And the example is of Libya. David Cameron went to war in Libya, military action in Libya, and then went to Parliament. He didn't go to Parliament first, right? So there is no convention like that. I don't think the EU point really works. I don't think the EU point, because the Prime Minister always had control over foreign policy. The EU never had control over foreign policy. Yeah. Yeah, that was my doorbell. Yes, thank you. It's AJ at the door. Yeah, probably so. Okay, how recently in contemporary examples, everything. Yeah, contemporary examples are just things that come after, I would say after 2015. I would call those contemporary examples. Yeah, I mean, maybe 2010 as well, but I would say 2015 are contemporary examples, right? I love contemporary examples. Now, yeah, you can talk about Blair's sofa government, and I would talk about it, but I would go beyond Blair's sofa government as well, right? I would go beyond that as well. Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Right, so this PowerPoint. So Samuel, don't upload this PowerPoint, please. So I don't want anyone to. I've put a lot of blood and toil into this PowerPoint, so you can get it from my website. It's a very nominal sum of £6, £8. I can't remember what I charged for it. It's not that expensive, right? But it took me a long time to put this PowerPoint together. So you can just buy it off my website and give me, allow me to buy 2 cups of coffee. So that would be wonderful. Okay. So yeah, everything here is my focus, not my predictions, my focus in this next week. That's the way to do it. Excellent. Thank you. is uh, uh, yeah, excellent. Ralph, what are you talking about? So how would you say PM was not become presidential as a counter argument in terms of foreign policy? Well, the argument goes in terms of foreign policy. You could say that the foreign minister still matters, right? You can say that in recent years, foreign policy has not become an issue for leaders in Britain, right? So after Tony Blair, foreign policy has become less of an issue, I think, for most politicians. So you could argue that, right? Um, and I think that's a good argument, right? I'm just going to put the plans because so many students are asking for it. Let me just put the plans here in the chat. So you guys, if you need to access the plans, you can access it there. Right. Zachariah, would doing essay plans on sample papers be a good idea? Yeah. After you go through these essays, I would say work on the sample papers. I think that's true. Excellent. Excellent. Good. So, thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I didn't mean to tell you off, Sarah. I hope both sides of your pillow are cold. That doesn't sound like a good thing, Mal Yara. That sounds like a curse, doesn't it? I hope both sides of your pillow are cold. That doesn't sound very good to me. That you're basically saying like you hope like I'm frozen. Is that what it means? Whoa, that's quite serious. Someone explain that to me because I hope I haven't been cursed by someone. Right. Excellent. Ralph, Dakota. Dakota, what are you going on about? Dakota, I'm going to put you in timeout for a little while. You need to rest for a little while, Dakota. If you have already mentioned this, but I don't know. Do you reckon that? Yeah, Ines, you'd have to go back to the video. You've come very late. I do think the EU can come up, yeah, and I've talked about that. Excellent. Cold pillows is a compliment. Oh, is that really? Okay. I need to. I haven't. Where have I been? I've done nothing about cold pillows. A pillow is what you sleep on. But surely you want a pillow to be warm because most of the time the country's cold, right? Right, because it's refreshing if you've got a cold pillow. Okay. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's a compliment. Okay. That's wonderful. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so let's just finish this off because I'm better than your politics teacher. Well, your politics teacher may have stuff on. Right. Evaluate the view that prime ministers have little control of it. Right. Now, guys, this is an event. This is a question that I think. Stop the cold pillow stuff, right? So, Sarah, no, having a warm pillow is uncomfortable. Cold pillows are refreshing. Okay. Yeah, Hallie, have you got any contemporary examples? I've got lots of contemporary examples and they're all in my plans. Sorry to be plugging the plans always, but they're in my plans. Excellent. Caught up in energy and eagerly awaiting the next breathtaking surprise. This is an experience worth every moment. Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, thank you for your overexcitement, Hugh. Excellent. Are you going to do info by info? Okay, Hugh, calm down now. Calm down. Thank you, Mal Yara. That's very kind of you. Right. Okay. This is a question that comes. Look. I'm going to go back to this box. They haven't asked anything about this yet. The powers of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to dictate events and determine policy. They have not asked a single question on this bullet point yet, right? Or these series of bullet points, right? So my advice to you is that plan this question here. Evaluate the view that a Prime Minister have little control over events. or evaluate the view that most prime ministers are victims of events, right? I think that's a really good, very good question, right? Um, yes. So, and again, some students may find this a difficult question, but yes, I think it's a good question, right? Yes, Steve Lana raises a good point. Would watching documentaries be a good way to remember case studies? Not really, except there's one documentary called Cabinet Confidential. Put it in the search on my website and watch Cabinet Confidential, because I think it's a really good documentary and it gives you a lot of good case studies for prime ministers. So it's good for this executive topic, I would say. Excellent. Okay, thank you, Emily. So I think this is a really good, by events, I say the following. We did a really good. So there was an alternative question here that evaluate the view that events, not policy agendas, have dominated the decision making of the British executive. Right. So events, not policies, dictate how the government works. By events, we mean economic disasters and economic events, foreign policy wars, and domestic disasters like COVID. So events are like big things that happened, right? Sophia, exactly. Harold Wilson, events, dear boy, events. Fantastic. I'm glad you remember that. You know that. You could talk about, so all of these, Tony Blair comes in here, the Iraq War comes in here. So I'm just taking some of your questions. Um, uh, da, 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 uh, no, the plans are the PowerPoints, Noah. Yeah, the plans and the PowerPoints are the same. Yeah. Why is this question so philosophical? You know, that's just my philosophical mind, I'm afraid. Can you argue Liz Truss was influenced by think tanks, so maybe she was a victim of the quasi-budget? Not really. That's not an event. That was something she did. That's her policy. So that's the opposite of events, right? These essay plans are all in my, yeah, they're all in the plans, exactly. Could you talk about Tony Blair and the Iraq War, Theresa May? I'm talking about it all here, and Brexit, exactly. All of that is coming in. Could you talk about Tony Blair, Iraq War? Exactly. Bojo and COVID, brilliant, right? So this is the way to argue, the way to put that events question together. And again, you can look at that in your own time, and fantastic. No, the plans and the PowerPoints are the same. So you get the same thing. Exactly, Sarah. That what I've shown you here is what my plans are. Exactly. Fantastic. Okay. And lastly, evaluate the view that the executive fulfills its functions poorly. Yeah. Evaluate the view that the executive fulfills its functions poorly. And again, my plans for this would be the executive, it has three functions. It controls the legislative agenda, it runs for government, and it makes use of its prerogative powers, right? That's what the executive do. And we talk about how the executive does make laws really well and how it doesn't, how the executive runs a government really well and how it doesn't, and how the executive uses prerogative powers and how it doesn't, right? So for and against, for and against, for and against, and you look at this plan, look at my plans in the booklet, and you should be able to answer that question well. So these are my predictions. That aren't really predictions. These are the focuses. Now, here's my view. If you were to plan in your own words or write out the difficult ones like the EU question and that sovereignty question, I believe very strongly that even if some of these questions don't come up, the details in these plans will help you answer another question, right? In the same way last time round, I didn't predict a democratic deficit question, but so many students emailed me and said, well, you did those three questions. We were able to take the bits out of those three questions and answer a democratic deficit question. So my advice to you is go through these as an urgency. I would strongly say to you that these plans will probably allow you to find a pathway through component 2. I can't say for sure. I'm not the examiner. I've never seen the exam paper, right? So I can't tell you for sure, but that is my sincere advice. I've never yet found, after doing these, and I've been doing these for a good number of years, these sessions, and certainly I've been doing these webinars for a good number of years. I've yet not found a single student who's come back to me and said that was a waste of time. None of that was helpful. Everyone said those plans, those webinars were really helpful, right? So as I said at the very beginning, if you feel that you need plans to help you with what we've discussed today, just for a few quid, you can get those plans off my website. If you're really struggling and you think you need someone to help to guide you through these questions more specifically, then I would purchase my webinars 2 and webinars 3 and 4, which go through UK government, right? And we've been doing those webinars started in January. So there's around I don't know 12 hours of videos there, as well as all of these plans as well in there. So I would highly advise that, right? Last week I got an email from a student who I sent the webinars to, and she had only I think 2 or 3 days to go through the webinars, and she got back to me at the end of the exam and said, man, without those webinars I would not have been able to pass. She felt she did really well. So my view is that if you are struggling at the moment, then the best thing you probably can do is watch those webinars, right? Maybe just start with 3 for now. Or if you think, the EU and sovereignty is your problem, then go to 4 and just look through those, because I highly recommend those, right? Noah, would you get marked down if you don't have a balanced argument? For example, completely arguing that events do play a role. No, well, your judgment will has to be unbalanced, but you got to give the other side, of course. You have to give the other side in the essay. So the judgment has to be one-sided, but in the essay, you have to give the other side in order for you to get the full marks, certainly. Otherwise, it will be a one-sided essay for sure. Good. Sorry, Dakota, but I make the rules. Sovereignty belongs to me here. Excellent. Evaluate for an extent to which Parliament fulfills its functions. Praying for that. That's a good question, isn't it? I think that's a very good question. I'm not going to be doing this for America. I do have a contemporary examples thing for America on my website, but I'm not going to do this for America. If by paper 3 you mean global politics, I will be putting up a global politics one soon. Yeah. But if you want, again, more details and you didn't attend my King's College thing, then I would suggest to you that you download the full video from King's College. Yes. Excellent. Yes, I'm just going through the rest of your questions. Anyway, look, I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I hope you've had enough time to. So if you haven't noted down the questions, you need to go back to this video when it comes live and note those questions down, right? Note them all down. Okay. So I think then we have probably reached the end here. We've probably done enough here. Excellent. Yeah, you should try to get a conclusion, even if it's a short conclusion. And I talk about this in my 30-mark, how to write a 30-mark answer. So you should try to do that. Right, good. Sam's leaving. Excellent. Right, so I'm going to end the stream now, unless you've got some last-minute questions. Otherwise, good luck. I would like you to tell me, maybe in the comments of this video, once you've done the exam, whether it was helpful or not. Right, so please do that, because it really does. I like it when you tell me that it was helpful. I know that component 1 was really helpful for students when we did that, so that's really good. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Marilena. Hello, it's going to be on my website. I'll send it out. If you haven't if you haven't signed up to my Substack, my newsletter, then do that. But it's all on my website. Good stuff. Thanks, Finley. Good to see you again. I don't have a favorite color. And yes, you do have to pay for the webinars, I'm afraid. Yes, excellent. Fantastic. Yes, Lewis. Yeah, I mean, overall, all those questions that I raised, I think. Okay, good. Excellent. Um, da, da. Yes, Katie, reform to the process of whips, scheduling. So the government should be allowed to schedule in Parliament, right? Sorry, not government. The speaker should be allowed to schedule in Parliament rather than the government. The government is in charge of scheduling. You can say that uh, the what else can we say? I think let me go back to that question. Um, in fact, where was the legislation one? It was here somewhere. Um, oh, I can't find it anymore. Why can't I find it? Oh, because it's in the wrong section. Sorry, it should be in Parliament. Here we go. So what I said here is, let's just quickly go through the legislative process. So passing legislation, and the counter argument is da, da, da. Yeah, the government controls timetabling. The government is able to repeal constitutional bills. The government can pass things very quickly. So yeah, it's really just that. It's all about that, right? Excellent. Okay, so I'm tired now. I need to go to sleep. In my on my code pillow. All right, guys. I will see you later, and I hopefully I probably won't. I may get a chance to do something on global politics. If I do get a chance, I will send it out. Otherwise, you should be able to see something on my website. All right, guys. See you later. Bye.